Hey there everybody, Zion over here from Nintendo Life, and today we're sharing with you the video version of our review of the successor to Castlevania, Bloodstained: Ritual of the Night. This review was originally written by Damian McFerrin and has been whipped into this video by me. The product of one of the most successful video game crowdfunding ventures of all time, Bloodstained: Ritual of the Night is, quite literally, an exercise in wish fulfillment. Following his departure from Konami in 2014, former Castlevania series producer Koji Igarashi would have required superhuman powers of resistance to ignore the flood of fan requests that he returned to the Metroidvania genre he made so famous with the likes of Castlevania Symphony of the Night, Aria of Sorrow, and Portrait of Ruin. And he has duly delivered that with this grand 2.5D adventure. So much so that at times it feels little more than a facsimile of his previous work. But when you're working from a template that's this accomplished, is there a reason to chastise someone for taking the safe route? Perhaps not in this case, but unfortunately, Nintendo Switch owners do have a few more things to grumble about when compared to their PlayStation and Xbox owning friends. Bloodstained obviously isn't part of the Castlevania series, but it takes so much inspiration from Igarashi's previous efforts in the series that it almost feels like a fan-made homage rather than a standalone game. There are numerous points in the game where you'll instantly think back to key locations or moments in older titles. The waterfall, for example, from Symphony of the Night is recreated here, and many of the enemies you'll remember fighting all those years ago resurface in subtly different forms. Heck, even Alucard's voice actor Robert Belgrade makes an appearance in a role that might seem oddly familiar. But despite the clear connection with his past work, Igarashi manages to tread the fine line between repetition and rediscovery, and there are enough new and unique foes to face that the recognizable ones don't outstay their welcome too much. One thing Igarashi was keen on from the start was avoiding having Dracula as your main opponent, which, to be fair, he could have easily done as the character isn't Konami's property and sits safely in the public domain. But while there is some reference to the world of vampires contained within the game, Bloodstained instead chooses to focus its gothic tale around the tragic Shardbinders, human experiments created by the mysterious Alchemist Guild, so they can be sacrificed and summon forth forces from hell which would convince the world that spiritual, rather than technological, progress was mankind's true path. The main character Miriam is one such Shardbinder, who is spared this grisly sacrifice when she falls into a 10-year slumber. When she awakes, she finds out her fellow Shardbinder and friend Jeeble has gone rogue. Driven by his thirst for revenge for the wrongs done to him and his kind, he summons a massive fortress called the Hellhold, and Miriam must venture inside to end his tyranny. As a Shardbinder, Miriam's body is covered in crystals, which, we are told, will ultimately cover her entirely, leading to her death. This is more than just a story beat though. As you defeat enemies, they randomly release shard skills, which unlock new attacks, demonic companions, and passive abilities. The Metroidvania tradition of gear gating the player's progress is also carried out by the slow and steady collection of unique shard powers, some of which allow you to open up parts of the castle. For example, when you defeat a certain boss, you are gifted with a shard that offers the ability to move heavy objects, which then in turn grants access to areas of the map and locations that lie outside of Hellhole's walls that were previously off limits. The shard scale system neatly mimics the soul collection mechanic seen in Aria of Sorrow and its sequel, Dawn of Sorrow. Many of these powers are pretty basic and simply involve releasing a monster which attacks on-screen enemies, but others, such as a ray which can turn foes into stone, are more interesting. The more shards you collect, the more powerful each skill becomes, and it's possible to level up these skills to make them more potent. In addition to your shard skills, you also have an inventory system which includes armor, headgear, accessories, and of course, weapons. Bloodstained's armory includes swords, spears, whips, axes, greatswords, daggers, and even handguns, and finding each and every one is an obsession in itself. Early on in the game, you establish a headquarters of sorts, which means you can buy and sell items as well as create new ones based on blueprints. A crafting system is also in place, allowing you to turn valuable item drops into powerful ones or healing items. You can also disassemble items into their core components in order to gain access to specific ingredients. The shards and weapons you acquire complement each other perfectly, offering up a combat system that seems basic at first, but actually rewards tactical play and experimentation. Do you release a wave of bats at an incoming foe and dive in after them to deliver the coup de grace? Or should you instead use a shard power to boost your defense and stay well back, taking out enemies at range with your weaker but safer firearm? The fact that you can also have multiple shards equipped at once really does add immeasurably to the complexity of battle, and the ability to swap between entirely separate equipment and shard loadouts via a shortcut system means you can have a configuration to suit every kind of encounter. As for the core exploration experience, if you've played a Metroidvania in the past few years, then you'll know the drill here. In theory, the entire castle is in play from the moment you start the game, but portions can only be accessed once you possess a certain item or ability. Save points are dotted around the building, as are warp points, which allow you to fast travel to certain sections. Despite its open nature, there are defined areas on the map, and many of these showcase a boss encounter. While there's nothing quite as memorable as the horrific Grand Falloon in Symphony of the Night or the nightmarish Puppet Master in Dawn of Sorrow, Bloodstained still has its fair share of unique and challenging enemies. In true Metroidvania fashion, your character gains experience from each enemy encounter, so even when you're having to backtrack through large portions of the castle, it never feels like a complete waste of time, as you're always moving towards that health and stat boost. Alongside your health bar, there's a mana point gauge, which is expended whenever you use a shard skill. This slowly recharges over time, but managing it becomes a prime concern early on. And thanks to Castlevania, there are purple flames scattered all around the castle, which yield MP refills as well as cash, which can be spent on valuable items in your aforementioned HQ. Bloodstained certainly feels like a proper Igarashi-made Castlevania, and the producer's love of quirky characters is retained as well. One enemy begs you not to kill them, and instead offers to cut your hair. This is the primary means of customizing Miriam's appearance, and you can change everything from her skin tone to the colors used on her dress. Another character sends you on revenge missions and is barely able to contain her anger as she points out which enemy killed which of her close family and friends. Then there's the dear old lady, who simply sits in your HQ and wants nothing more than to be fed fine food. Of course though, she'll give you some pretty rare items if you bring her the right meal. Racing through the main story will take you a considerable amount of time, but Bloodstained is packed with side quests which will keep completionists glued to the screen. And that's not to mention the multiple endings that reward repeat playthroughs. Despite the fact that it was one of Kickstarter's most successful video game campaigns, the $5.5 million initially raised in 2015 is still peanuts in the world of multi-format development. And while additional funds will have generated via the publishing deal with 505 Games, it's clear that Bloodstained was made on a tight budget, and one that will have no doubt gotten much tighter following that delay. This manifests itself in a number of ways. Certain locations look empty and lifeless, while a few of the certain character models are almost of Wii quality. The audio also suffers from some poor quality effects, although it should be said that the soundtrack, which is mostly composed by Castlevania series veteran Michiru Yamane, is superb, and does a lot to connect Bloodstained with Konami's famous franchise. These issues apply to all the versions available, but the Switch port, unfortunately, as you have to have heard by now, has additional problems that impact the experience further. For starters, the frame rate has been cut in half to 30 frames per second, and while it does a good job of maintaining that goal, there are numerous times when it dips even lower, and sometimes even pauses for a fraction of a second, giving a jerky and rather unpleasant performance. This is both predictable and erratic at the same time. During one intense sequence, which involves a zoomed out camera angle, a rotating tower, and multiple enemies, the frame rate was all over the place, which is understandable when you consider the amount happening on screen. However, the frame rate drops are just as alarming when you read a book from one of the many shelves mysteriously dotted around the castle. After reading the book, the game often slows down so much it feels like it's moving in slow motion, and doesn't return to normal until you exit the room and enter another. This is clearly one of the many performance issues Inti Creates and Artplay have said they will address in a further update, but it gives you an idea of how rough this port is. Input lag is another problem. While it's not game-breaking, there's enough of a delay between your button presses and the on-screen action to make the whole thing feel heavy and leaden. Elsewhere, visual effects such as the running water on the ship in the opening level and real-time shadows have either been scaled back or sacrificed entirely, while texture quality is noticeably much lower on Switch than on other systems, leading to a muddy and ill-defined look. We also noticed 3D models popping in as we entered certain scenes. For example, when entering a warp room, the frame of the stained glass picture would start off with basic geometry, and then fill in after a second or two. A minor, but still quite jarring event which destroys immersion and reminds you that you're playing a video game. The close-up portraits of the main characters, which appear during dialogue sequences, are hardly what you'd call attractive on the PS4 Pro version, but they look downright ugly on Switch thanks to reduced texture quality and a resolution drop. Speaking of which, the game appears to run in 720p docked and 540p handheld, although some dynamic scaling may be in play during certain points. And while we're here, load times vary from instant to painfully long. Some seemingly minor transitions between rooms can take as long as 5 seconds. A patch may well fix the majority of these problems, but it's clear that the process of porting Bloodstained to Switch hasn't been smooth sailing, and remember, it was originally slated for Wii U. Even if the admittedly minor problems are ironed out, it's unlikely that Inti Creates and Artplay are going to be able to get the Switch version on level ground with the versions available on the base PS4 and Xbox One consoles, at least from a visual and performance standpoint. It's unfortunate, but it should be clear by now that if you do have the option to play Bloodstained on any other system, then you should probably avoid the Switch edition. But as a counterpoint to that, this is actually a game that's incredibly well suited to portable play. In fact, Metroidvanias really do lend themselves to Nintendo consoles, and handhelds in general. Multiple save points and a massive non-linear environment to explore means Bloodstained is ideal for playing in short bursts. So in that regard, the Switch version does offer one advantage over its siblings. Whether or not you're willing to put up with this version's myriad of technical shortcomings in order to live the dream of Bloodstained on the move is for you alone to answer. There's no denying that Bloodstained Ritual of the Night is a fantastic Metroidvania, and arguably in the same class as the likes of Symphony of the Night and Aria of Sorrow. In that respect, it's mission accomplished for Koji Igarashi. He has fulfilled the promise he made back in 2015 to create a spiritual successor to the Castlevania games he's famous for. Bloodstained packs in hours of engaging gameplay, a complex and rewarding combat system, loads of collectibles, and plenty of gothic atmosphere. It's just a shame that Igarashi wasn't able to stage this revival within the Castlevania series itself. But fans should count themselves lucky. There hasn't been a full-blown Castlevania entry since 2014's divisive Lords of Shadow 2, and it would seem that the publisher is content to allow that esteemed series to fester in its grave for the time being, minus the Castlevania slots or the cash grab compilation packages. Despite the fact that this is unquestionably a very fine video game, there's no escaping the fact that the Switch version has some serious issues. Assets are notably weaker than any other version, the frame rate is halved, and the loading times are maddeningly protracted at points. Fingers are crossed that the developers can remedy some of these problems with the proposed updates, but for the time being, this is arguably the least impressive version of the game. Although the fact that it's portable perhaps counts for more than you'd think. We here at Nintendo Life give Bloodstained Ritual of the Night on the Nintendo Switch a 7 out of 10. Now, this review was originally written around the time of the game's launch, and recently, one of the senior community managers of 505 Games, which is the publishing company, made this statement on behalf of Iga and his team. Initially, we had planned to release a number of small updates to give incremental improvements. After looking at what needs to be accomplished, our goal is to bundle performance improvements into likely one patch. Doing so eases the submission process and will result in an overall faster completion. Since this is still in development, we don't have a firm ETA. We will update everyone when we have a more concrete release window. So with that, we're all keeping our fingers crossed over here at Nintendo Life, because honestly, the game is a ton of fun on Switch. It just has a lot of problems. So here's to hoping that they all get fixed soon.